the Indo-European linguistic stem, scholars reached the conclusion that they were part of the Aryan lordly people that appeared from somewhere near the Caspian Sea toward the end of the 2nd millennium BC and spread westward to Asia Minor, eastward to India, and southward to what the Old Testament called the lands of the Medes and Parsis. Yet all was not that simple. In spite of the assumed foreign origin of these invaders, the Old Testament treated them as part and parcel of biblical events. Cyrus, for example, was considered to be an anointed of Yahweh, quite an unusual relationship between the Hebrew God and a non-Hebrew. According to the biblical book of Ezra, Cyrus acknowledged his mission to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem and stated that he was acting upon orders given by Yahweh, whom he called God of heaven. Cyrus and the other kings of his dynasty called themselves Achaemenids, after the title adopted by the founder of the dynasty, which was Hasmonean-ish. It was not an Aryan but a perfect Semitic title, which meant wise man. By and large, scholars have neglected to investigate the many letters that may point to similarities between the Hebrew god Yahweh and the deity Achaemenids called Wise Lord, whom they depicted as hovering in the skies within a winged globe, as shown on the royal seal of Darius. It has been established by now that the cultural, religious, and historic roots of these old Persians go back to the earlier empires of Babylon and Assyria, whose extent and fall is recorded in the Old Testament. The symbols that make up the script that appeared on the Achaemenid monuments and seals were at first considered to be decorative designs. Engelbert Kampfer, who visited Persepolis, the old Persian capital, in 1686, described the signs as cuneids, or wedge-shaped impressions. The script has since been known as cuneiform. As efforts began to decipher the Achaemenid inscriptions, it became clear that they were written in the same script as inscriptions found on ancient artifacts and tablets in Mesopotamia, the plains and highlands that lay between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Intrigued by the scattered finds, Paul Emile Botta set out in 1843 to conduct the first major purposeful excavation. He selected a site in northern Mesopotamia, near present-day Mosul, now called Khorsabad. Botta was soon able to establish that the cuneiform inscriptions named the place Der Sharaken. They were Semitic inscriptions, in a sister language of Hebrew, and the name meant walled city of the righteous king. Our textbooks call this king Sargonai. This capital of the Assyrian king had as its center a magnificent royal palace, whose walls were lined with sculptured bas-reliefs, which, if placed end to end, would one stretch for over a mile. Commanding the city and the royal compound was a step pyramid called a ziggurat. It served as a stairway to heaven for the gods. The layout of the city and the sculptures depicted a way of life on a grand scale. The palaces, temples, houses, stables, warehouses, walls, gates, columns, decorations, statues, artworks, towers, ramparts, terraces, gardens, all were completed in just 5 years. According to Georges Cantonal Quotidian of Babylon, at Enasiri, the imagination reels before the potential strength of an empire which could accomplish so much in such a short space of time, some 3,000 years ago. Not to be outdone by the French, the English appeared on the scene in the person of Sir Austen Henry Layard, who selected as his site a place some 10 miles down the Tigris River from Khorsabad. The natives called it Qianjik. It turned out to be the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. Biblical names and events had begun to come to life. Nineveh was the royal capital of Assyria, under its last 3 great rulers Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashur-banipal. Now, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, did Sennacherib king of Assyria come up against all the walled cities of Judah, relates the Old Testament Kings 18:13, and when the angel of the Lord smote his army, Sennacherib departed, and went back, and dwelt in Nineveh. The mounds where Nineveh was built by Sennacherib and Ashur-banipal revealed palaces, temples, and works of art that surpassed those of Sitchin. The area where the remains of Esarhaddon's palaces are believed to lie cannot be excavated, for it is now the site of a Muslim mosque erected over the purported burial place of the prophet Jonah, who was swallowed by a whale when he refused to bring Yahweh's message to Nineveh. Layard had read in ancient Greek records that an officer in Alexander's army saw a place of pyramids and remains of an ancient city, a city that was already buried in Alexander's time. Later dug it up, too, and it turned out to be Nimrud, Assyria's military center. It was there that Shalmaneser I set up an obelisk to record his military expeditions and conquests. Now on exhibit at the British Museum, the obelisk lists among the kings who were made to pay tribute Jehu, son of Omri, king of Israel. Again, the Mesopotamian inscriptions and biblical texts supported each other. Astounded by increasingly frequent corroboration of the biblical narratives by archaeological finds, the Assyriologists, as these scholars came to be called, turned to the 10th chapter of the book of Genesis. There Nimrod, a mighty hunter by the grace of Yahweh, was described as the founder of all the kingdoms of Mesopotamia, and the beginning of his kingdom Babel and Erech and Akkad, all in the land of Shinar. Out of that land there emanated Asher, where Nineveh was built, a city of wide streets, and Kala, and Resen, the great city, which is between Nineveh and Kala. There were indeed mounds the natives called Kala, lying between Nineveh and Nimrud. When teams under W. Andre excavated the area from 1903 to 1914, they uncovered the ruins of Asher, the Assyrian religious center, and its earliest capital. Of all the Assyrian cities mentioned in the Bible, only Resen remains to be found. The name means horse's bridle. Perhaps it was the location of the royal stables of Assyria. At about the same time as Asher was being excavated, teams under Arkoldway were completing the excavation of Babylon, the biblical Babel, the vast place of palaces, temples, hanging gardens, and the inevitable ziggurat. Before long, artifacts and inscriptions unveiled the history of the two competing empires of Mesopotamia, Babylonia and Assyria, the one centered in the south, the other in the north. Rising and falling, fighting and coexisting, the two constituted a high civilization that encompassed some 1,500 years, both rising circa 1900 BC. Asher and Nineveh were finally captured and destroyed by the Babylonians in 614 and 612 BC, respectively. As predicted by the biblical prophets, Babylon itself came to an inglorious end when Cyrus the Achaemenid conquered it in 539 BC. Though they were rivals throughout their history, one would be hard put to find any significant differences between Assyria and Babylonia in cultural or material matters. Even though Assyria called its chief deity Asher all-seeing and Babylonia hailed Marduk son of the Pulamon, the pantheons were otherwise virtually alike. Many of the world's museums count among their prize exhibits the ceremonial gates, winged bulls, bas-reliefs, chariots, tools, utensils, jewelry, statues, and other objects made of every conceivable material that have been dug out of the mounds of Assyria and Babylonia. But the true treasures of these kingdoms were their written records, thousands upon thousands of inscriptions in the cuneiform script, including cosmologic tales, epic poems, histories of kings, temple records, commercial contracts, marriage and divorce records, astronomical tables, astrological forecasts, mathematical formulas, geographic lists, grammar and vocabulary school texts, and, not least of all, texts dealing with the names, genealogies, epithets, deeds, powers, and duties of the gods, the common language that formed the cultural, historical, and religious bond between Assyria and Babylonia was Akkadian. It was the first known Semitic language, Akkadian, but predating Hebrew, Aramaic, Phoenician, and Canaanite. But the Assyrians and Babylonians laid no claim to having invented the language or its script. Indeed, many of their tablets bore the postscript that they had been copied from earlier originals. Who, then, invented the cuneiform script and developed the language, its precise grammar, and rich vocabulary? Who wrote the earlier originals? And why did the Assyrians and Babylonians call the language Akkadian? Attention once more focuses on the book of Genesis and the beginning of his kingdom Babel and Erech and Akkad. Akkad, could there really have been such a royal capital, preceding Babylon and Nineveh? The ruins of Mesopotamia have provided conclusive evidence that once upon a time there indeed existed a kingdom by the name of Akkad, established by a much earlier ruler, who called himself a Sharukan righteous ruler. He claimed in his inscriptions that his empire stretched by the grace of his god Enlil, from the lower sea, the Persian Gulf, to the upper sea believed to be the Mediterranean. He boasted that at the wharf of Akkad, he made moorships from Indus